Ladies and gentlemen, I'm John Hitt, and for the past 12 years it's been my honor and privilege to serve as the president of the University of Central Florida. We've had a lot of great events, and I just everything I've heard about today's activity says that this Lou Frey symposium is just one of the best, and we're looking so much forward to this evening's event. It's a delight to see all of you here. Let me add my very warm personal greetings and welcome to each of you. We're so pleased you can be with us this evening. 30 years ago tonight, our keynote speaker was embroiled in the investigation of a lifetime. He'd been following a story of money, politics, and corruption for months, one that led him all the way to the White House. If it hadn't actually happened, some novelist would have written it. Bob Woodward is a legend in investigative journalism and has won nearly every prize that American journalism offers. Together with Carl Bernstein, he broke the Watergate story in the Washington Post, earning the paper a Pulitzer Prize and changing the course of American political history forever. And he and Bernstein co-authored the definitive book on Watergate, All the President's Men, in 1974. Woodward is the only contemporary American writer to co-author or author 9 #1 best-selling nonfiction books. His latest, Bush at War, examines the first 18 months of the Bush White House. That's interesting.
It's the plumbers.
Somebody's testing my eyesight. I've practiced reading in the dark, and it doesn't help. But Mr. Woodward's book, Bush at War, is based on hundreds of interviews throughout the Bush administration, and his account provides the first in-depth, behind-the-scenes story of a new untested president as he responds to the worst acts of terror ever committed on American soil. Newsweek magazine has excerpted 5 of Woodward's books in headline-making cover stories. 3 of his books have been made into movies. 60 Minutes has featured 3 of his books, and Dateline 4 of them. He is, I understand, currently finishing yet another, and he's a frequent guest and commentator on many news and current affairs shows. In his spare time, he serves as the assistant managing editor of the Washington Post. On February 7, 1992, the New York Times said, "Bob Woodward is the most famous investigative reporter in America." We're honored to have him join us this evening. Please join me in welcoming Bob Woodward.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Frequently, when I give speeches, Gordon Liddy does the sound. But this is the first time he's done the lights. So he has expanded. Never forget Liddy. I'd love to just get a sense of who you are and ask some questions, kind of poll questions, not about Watergate, but about contemporary politics. As the President said, I have just finished a book on the Iraq War, which will be out in 3 weeks, called Plan of Attack, very much an inside account of what Bush and Cheney and Powell and Rumsfeld and CIA Director Tenet and Condi Rice, how this decision was made to launch the war in Iraq. How many of you in the coming election, and because we're in Florida, I want to phrase this very carefully, how many of you either will or intend to vote for the Democratic nominee, most likely Mr. Kerry? Please raise your hands. Just one hand, please, man. In Florida, okay. How many either will or intend to vote for President Bush? Please raise your hands. Okay, fewer. How many intend or will vote for Ralph Nader? They told me you were finished in politics here, but I didn't. You've just certified it. President Bush's tax cuts. How many people think that is good economic policy, not for you, but for the country? How many think it's good economic policy? How many think it's bad economic policy? Okay, overwhelmingly against. How many basically think the war in Iraq was necessary? Raise your hands. But necessary or the right thing? Basically support it. How many do not support it, think it was the wrong thing? Okay, good. Those are actually 3 trick questions. I'm trying to figure out how many rich, warmongering Republicans there are here tonight. So always be careful when somebody comes polling. Still being in the news business, I'm always in touch with what's going on, and I don't know that you heard the latest. Remember a number of years ago during the Clinton administration, there was this spate of fence jumpings at the White House, people climbing the fences trying to get in. I understand late this afternoon they caught Condi Rice jumping the fence trying to get out. I want to talk a little bit about Nixon and Watergate, and there's so much that could be said about it. You obviously, and I really wish I could have been here today for all the presentations and the debate and discussion. So I'm going to kind of pick some things at random that I have thought about, some of the reporting that I did, some of the thoughts about what Watergate, now 30 years after Nixon's resignation, might mean and what we might learn from it. First of all, as many of you are familiar, there is a new batch of Nixon tapes that come out each season almost. At the Washington Post, we call this the gift that keeps giving. And in many ways, it does. How many of you have kind of at least read the transcripts of some of the tapes or actually gone and put the headphones on? It perhaps should be a requirement of citizenship because it's very interesting to go in and hear exactly what was said and what went on. My reaction to the tapes is, and this is well documented in a sense, I believe the tapes are going to define the Nixon presidency. So often the president is ordering illegal activity, abusive activity, but what I found most chilling about the Nixon tapes, and I've indeed not listened to all of them, and the emphasis has been on the abuse of power tapes that have been released and the Watergate tapes and so forth. But what is the most chilling element of what went on is the smallness of it, that at least I have never heard. The dog that never barks on the Nixon tapes is someone saying what would be right, what would be good. Too often the discussion is about Nixon. It's about him and settling the score, helping somebody who has been a long-time promoter and supporter, that you see this Nixon too often using the presidency almost as an instrument of personal revenge. That is not what the presidency is about or should be. And going back to Nixon and Watergate, having written about the presidents since Nixon, tried to work out for myself a definition of what's the job What's a job description of being president? What, if you had to say in a sentence or two, and the sentence I come up with is that the job of the President of the United States is to define the next stage of good for a majority of people in the country. Now, the next stage of good, it should be for a true majority, not for a party or an interest group. It can be fixing the economy, winning a war, saving the environment, developing energy independence. It could be anything. But the President's basic job is to sit and say, what's that next stage of good? Define it, announce it, develop a plan to get there, and then execute it. And though clearly, and I will get to these issues, Nixon is a paradoxical figure in my view. But in that fundamental role of defining the next stage of good for the people in this country, he failed. He did some important things in foreign policy, but in Watergate and the hydra of activities that are also all part of Watergate, he broke the law, and he broke that faith with the basic question of defining the next stage of good for a real majority of people in this country. And if I were to write another book about Nixon, which I will not do, it would be called The Wrong Man, that he was out of the tradition of defining that next stage of good, and really, and always, and often there's immense political disagreement, even moral disagreement about a course a president might set, but the president has to do that, and in that I think he failed. The interesting question in Nixon, and the question that pulses through everything you look at about him, particularly Watergate and the abusive activities, the question that pulses is why? Why did he do this? What was in him or in the political system? Now, when you really get to that question, you almost have to turn to psychiatry and get to a point where somebody is going to analyze what was in this individual. Len Garment, who was Nixon law partner, worked for Nixon in the White House, was one of his lawyers during Watergate, wrote a memoir in which Garment said the following about Nixon. And this was Garment talking about Nixon, his friend. He said he was filled with a virtuoso collection of wounds and angers accumulated during childhood wars, political wars, especially with the media, and wars of survival. That Nixon almost lived, and as he did in one of his books called Six Crises, he lived from crisis to crisis. And Garment said it was Nixon's very own home-brewed antidepressant. Whether that's right or not, that's somebody who knew Nixon as well as anybody. Now, there is this paradox in Nixon, always. And I just want to take a couple of examples that show that some surprising things about him. On April 29th, 1973, as Watergate was unraveling and Nixon had to fire his closest aides, Bob Haldeman and John Ehrlichman, he brought to Camp David Elliot Richardson, who was then the Secretary of Defense. He asked Richardson to become the Attorney General and oversee the Watergate investigation. Richardson was to appoint a special prosecutor to conduct that independent investigation. Sitting with Richardson in a moment of despair, this time when Nixon was losing two of his closest aides, people truly close to him. Nixon said the following to Richardson: "You must pursue this investigation even if it leads to the president," end quote. Nixon declared his innocence but said, quote, "If need be, save the presidency from the president," end quote. Richardson, on his own legal pad, paraphrased Nixon's words, writing the following: "If the monster is me, save the country." Extraordinary. In that moment, perhaps Nixon glimpsed the larger danger, not just to himself and what had been concealed and the lies and the crimes, but there was something valiant and almost self-aware in setting this mechanism in place that would eventually reveal him and destroy his presidency. He helped unleash the ruthless inquiry that brought him down. He also secretly had his office and telephone conversations taped, as we know, and incredibly, he saved the tapes. In an odd, truly paradoxical way, Nixon was his own best investigator. He created the record and preserved the truth. He was the one who turned himself in to a certain extent. The other paradox about Nixon that I would note, the day Nixon resigned in August 1974, Nixon was incredibly intelligent man, very, very smart, and he understood lots of things. And on the day he resigned, he had gone on television and announced that he was resigning the night before, and then the day of the resignation, he called his cabinet and senior staff, the White House staff, to the East Room. And it was a farewell address. Some of you may remember seeing it. It's quite a moment. And he had his wife and two daughters and two son-in-laws with him, and there was no text. It was Nixon raw and pretty much unedited. He talked about his mother and his father, read from Teddy Roosevelt's diary, and then he got to that moment, somebody does in a very emotional, self-revealing speech like that, where he kind of said with his body language, "Look, this is why I called you all here." And he said precisely the following: "Always remember, others may hate you, but those who hate you don't win unless you hate them, and then you destroy yourself." Now think about that. He identified the poison that had brought him to that moment. He had struggled all his life to gain the presidency, and he realized that the poison was hate, that the piston in so many ways, in too many ways, and too often, driving the Nixon presidency was hate, score settling, vengeance. And at that moment, he had to leave and give up the presidency. He realized he couldn't call it back, he couldn't change it, but he realized intellectually what had happened to him and brought him down. And so he shared that moment and that insight with people who were close to him, and shared it with the country and with history. And if you look at the American presidency or American politics, it often gets rough and ugly. Awful things happen in politics. Awful things happen in war. 9/11 was one of the most hateful acts committed in known history. To drive airplanes into buildings where you're killing women and children and civilians and so forth, unheard of tactic in any kind of normal warfare, a hateful act. go around the country and you talk to people, or there are a group of widows who lost their husbands in the World Trade Center that I've talked to, and you hear all of these emotions from people of despair, bafflement, how am I going to put my life back together, how did this happen, the full spectrum of emotions. But in the most fascinating way, the emotion I've never heard from any of these people is hate. They have grief, they have consternation, and they go as low emotionally in many cases as you can, but there is never that sense of hate. And in fact, what is probably the great strength of this country is very simply that we are not haters, that there are a lot of rough things said and done, but at the end, it's not hateful. And Nixon, unfortunately, was out of that tradition. Fortunately for history and the lesson that might be incorporated in the tapes and his presidency and his own words, he realized that in hating, you wind up destroying yourself. There are a couple of moments as I've gone through the tapes I wanted to just illustrate some of the things about Nixon. After more and more tapes came out in recent years, I sent one of my assistants to the archives to look Carl Bernstein and myself up and see if we showed up on the tapes at all. And, an act of repertorial self-protection, perhaps. And in the spring of 1973, as Watergate was about to explode, Carl and I talked, and I went to the White House and asked to talk to Ron Ziegler, the press secretary, and I was given his deputy, Jerry Warren. And I said to Warren, we have information that Watergate really is going to explode, that there are more tentacles out there, and said we would like to talk to President Nixon, interview him about this. Ziegler then advised Nixon of this request, and this appears in a Ziegler-Nixon tape. President saying, "Tell Woodward, stay 100% away from it. There's no fact to it. There's no substance." Nixon finally advised Ziegler to warn me. "Tell him he better watch his goddamn ass. They're going to attack the president's men, but they must not attack the president." Not very friendly. And the other point I wanted to make about Watergate in terms of how do you look at it, or how do you fit the pieces together? And one of the things, I look at Watergate having 5 stages, essentially. And the first stage of Watergate was, it really can be defined as Nixon's 5 wars. His first war or phase came when he more or less declared war against the anti-Vietnam War movement. He was continuing the war. He was trying to extricate the country from the war and the loud vocal opposition, and he did not understand that, and they began spying and doing some of these illegal activities against the anti-war movement. The second phase of that war was, to a certain extent, against the media, because the media was reporting more intensely on the conduct of the Vietnam War and the anti-war movement. The third phase was really to take the mechanism that was doing this and shift it over even the burglary squad of Howard Hunt and Gordon Liddy, who had done the Ellsberg burglary, to declare war essentially on the Democrats. And that's why the Democratic headquarters was burglarized by the same group that went after Ellsberg. There is a DNA connection in lots of this. The fourth phase was when, after the Watergate burglars were caught and a lot of the stories started coming out, and Nixon essentially declared war against the system of justice. And this was the cover-up. And the fifth phase of Nixon's war, after he left office, was in large part a war against history, to essentially say, no, Watergate was a blip, it didn't happen this way, and he conducted this 20-year war against history. Now, one of the most interesting things about Nixon is this inner psychic, whatever he was doing and however he was doing it, and that needs to be left to the psychiatrists or the psychohistorians. But one of the largest thought as a reporter I take from this experience and looking at Watergate is that what the great danger to this country in the end is not terrorism or problems in the economy. The real danger to this country will be secret government. If a group of people essentially go off and say, we're going to play by our own rules, we're going to do it this way, we're not going to worry about the law or the rules or the political opposition, we are marching in this direction no matter what. And that really is the lesson of Watergate. And what is interesting after Watergate, not all, but most politicians kind of internalized that lesson, that you can't do things in secret, you are going to be found out. Now, at the same time, as you report on these things, one of the things you learn to be humble as a journalist, because you realize what you didn't know, and you also realize what you got wrong or failed to understand. I remember the day that Gerald Ford, when he, in his first month of being president, went on national television on a Sunday morning in September 1974 and announced that he had given Nixon a full pardon. I happened to be in New York City that morning and was asleep and didn't know that, and my colleague at the Post, Carl Bernstein, called and woke me up and said, "Have you heard?" And I hadn't heard anything, and I was kind of defensive, and he said, "Have you heard? It's amazing." And I said, "What?" And Carl, who has this facility to say what happened in the fewest number of words, said the following: "The son of a bitch pardoned the son of a bitch." I told that story in the presence of former President Ford last year, and he just about fell off his chair. I pretty much thought, the pardon was a deal. The pardon was, in a sense, a continuation of, remember, Ford had promised the long national nightmare of Watergate was going to be over, that it was part of Watergate politics, really, and adopted and absorbed and believed that conventional wisdom for a long time. Then about 25 years later, about 6 or 7 years ago, I decided to do a book on the legacy of Watergate and the impact on all the presidents. The book was called Shadow: 5 Presidents and the Legacy of Watergate. And I had never interviewed or met Gerald Ford, so I called his office and said I was doing this. Could I come talk to him, expecting that I would not get to first base. They called back and said, oh, he's going to be in New York, be happy to talk to you. So I went up and interviewed him, put my tape recorder down in his hotel room. No press people, no aide, nobody there. And Ford began answering every question about the pardon, why he did it, the sequence. There are voluminous records, memoirs. A lot of the people are still alive. I interviewed them. I re-interviewed them. I saw Ford a couple more times, and for hours, literally would say, this is what, yeah, there's that document. Yes, he acknowledged, he believed that he was offered a deal by Alexander Haig, who was Nixon's chief of staff, but Ford argues, to me quite persuasively, that he turned the deal down. And he argued with conviction and passion that he pardoned Nixon for a number of reasons. First, that the country needed to get over Watergate. That if Nixon was indicted, tried, went to jail, there would be another year, 2 years, 3 years of Watergate, and that the country could not tolerate that. Number two, Gerald Ford wanted his own presidency, wanted to be not living in the shadow of Nixon and Watergate. Three, he got information reliably that Nixon was despondent, depressed, that something awful might happen, that maybe the former president would take his life, and for humanitarian reasons, Ford felt he had to grant the pardon. And he went through other reasons and explained it. And when I got done, I realized, and this is what's sobering and important, how wrong I had it. In fact, the Nixon pardon was an act of statesmanship, was an act of compassion, was in many ways an act of political self-sacrifice on the part of Gerald Ford, because that, I think you can argue that that pardon cost him the 1976 election to Jimmy Carter, who was running on the other side of the equation saying, I'll never lie to you unless you catch me. So that it was most interesting to see when you microscopically go through and, in a sense, interrogate the record and the people and look at all of this, that Ford did exactly the right thing, very much on instinct. He had lawyers, he debated it, and so forth, and he just felt this is the right thing, gave his reasons, and then in one of the interviews, Ford pulled out his wallet, and I thought, what's this? And he had a yellowed clipping from an old Supreme Court decision, the verdict decision in the early 1900s, which says that the acceptance of a pardon is, in effect, an admission of guilt. And he said that, he believes, is the correct legal interpretation of the acceptance of the pardon. It is debatable, but he finds that comforting and carries it around in his wallet. So it's, again, one of those examples, and it happens time and time again where you go back and replow ground as a journalist, and that it doesn't turn out to be, in fact, it was not the way you thought it was. How many of you have seen the old John Wayne movie called The Sands of Iwo Jima? It's about, you were probably there. Right? Lou was. Great World War II movie. John Wayne plays a sergeant named Stryker. And there's a scene in which, with all of John Wayne's authority, he is talking to a young Marine and being the sergeant, and he says to the young Marine, "Son, life is tough, but life is tougher if you're stupid." We're going to have that chiseled over the doorway when you go into the Washington Post. And it should be figuratively above the doorway of all of us, because to a certain extent it's true. Often just stupid things happen. And, what's the mechanism for preventing stupid things? I interviewed this President Bush about 9/11 and asked, how do you do that? I didn't quite put it as directly as that. How do you keep from doing stupid things? But it was, what's the process? And he made the point, he said, we grind things out and within the War Cabinet, and we have to reach consensus. He said, I'll make the decision, but I want a consensus among that group of people in the War Cabinet before we do anything. If you go back and look at Nixon, interestingly enough, some of the problems, maybe all of the problems that Nixon had were process problems. What was the process of grinding out decisions? Too many decisions were made. Nixon sitting around with Haldeman or Ehrlichman or Colson, one or two people, not a filter to check it out. And I've often said it and I've often thought, and I don't mean to disparage people who were Nixon's lawyers who made an effort, but if Nixon had had one strong, forceful lawyer in his inner circle who'd gone in there and slammed his fist down on the table and said, God damn it, Mr. President, you can't do this. Don't do this to yourself. Don't do this to the country. It's illegal. It won't work. Maybe Nixon would have listened. The absence of process in the Nixon White House has always fascinated me. If you compare it with President Clinton and what happened to Clinton in his impeachment, and what is the lesson Clinton learned from Watergate? It's most interesting and surprising. In Watergate with Nixon, you had all the tapes, you had all of the memoirs and testimony of former aides. And if you look at the record, really, almost all of his former aides, one way or another, either wrote memoirs or testified adversely to Nixon, or said that, yeah, he ordered that illegal activity, or he asked me to do this, or he wanted that. And also it was an era in which people wrote things down. There are memos that are absolutely astonishing. As a reporter, people don't write things down like they did during the Nixon era. So you really had three mountains of evidence: tapes, testimony, and the written record. In the case of Clinton, the three witnesses who could have given damaging testimony about Clinton in the Lewinsky affair, that there was something illegal. Betty Curry's secretary, Monica Lewinsky herself, and Vernon Jordan, his good friend, all testified, yes, there was sex, there was embarrassment, there was concealment, but the president never ordered me to lie or conceal or do anything obstructive or illegal. in a sense, what Clinton did, he learned the lesson of Watergate, or the wrong lesson. Don't confide in anyone. Don't tell anyone. We know he didn't confide in his wife about lots of things. Didn't confide in his lawyers. Didn't really confide in people who were around. So he just became more inward, and under the premise that any one of these people in his White House or in his circle could be a witness against him, and so he was not going to do anything that would give them that ammunition. The last thing before getting to questions, and what I really want to spend the most time on, a number of years ago, the head of Simon & Schuster, which has published all of my books, took me out to dinner in New York City. Now, if you know anything about the publishing business, the publishers will take you out to lunch all the time because it's on the company time. But dinner is on their time, so it's unheard of almost to be asked to dinner. So I'm asked to dinner, and I said, something's up. So he sat down and he said, okay, what's your next book? And I said, well, I wanted to think about it and do some interviewing and try to find the right subject. He said, look, damn it, we are in the marketing and the product delivery business. What's your next book? And he kept needling me. So finally, around the dessert course, I said, okay, I've decided my next book will be about the publishing business in New York City, which he was delighted to hear. And he said, that's fabulous because I have a tremendous title for you. I said, I didn't think there were any tremendous titles left. He said, there's one. Your book on the publishing business in New York City will be called My Last Book. You have no idea how much he meant it. Let me stop there and let's do questions. Thank you very much. Thank you.
I wonder if you noticed that more of the folks who indicated a Republican bent were in the reserve section. Probably because they worked harder.
I'm going to go back to Washington and say the culture wars are alive in Central Florida.
It would be wonderful, sir, if that were true. I was wondering if you foresaw that as a kind of miniature, an ideally miniature signal of a two-tier society that might eventually evolve in America.
Basically, no, I don't think so, because there is a lot of mobility. Some of those people are going to be fired tomorrow, and they'll go over to the dark side. And some of the people, it's mobile, and people are basically optimistic about that. I don't think. Notice the number of people. I mean, I'm going to just risk this. How many people here raised their hands opposing or saying that they didn't think the Bush tax cuts were good economic policy for the country? How many of those people also know it's good economic policy for them? In other words, they're paying less taxes. Are there anybody? See? A lot of people up front here, too. So in a sense, people don't always vote, or at least in this form, their pocketbook. Let the next person.
Okay, I just wanted to ask you what you thought of Richard Clark.
Oh, Richard, who's he? The counterterrorism person. I mean, I've thought too much about it because Clark keeps running around. I mean, his central point or allegation against President Bush is that he did not act with urgency to deal with the terrorist problem before 9/11. When I interviewed President Bush, and this is in my book, Bush at War, I asked him, what was your sense of urgency? And Bush, on the record, is quoted saying, "I did not feel a sense of urgency. My blood was not boiling." What all old reporters do when a story comes out that somebody has and it becomes quite sensational, they say what I say. I had it out of the president's mouth, saying exactly that. It's most interesting. But it's an election year, and I think there is a sense in the country of what happened before 9/11. Let's get all the details out. The book I did on Bush at War and in response to 9/11 sold more copies than the Watergate books that Carl Bernstein and I did, because people wanted to know what went on behind the scenes. And so, go ahead, ma'am.
My initial question was how you felt when you heard that President Ford had pardoned Nixon, but you already answered that one pretty clearly. My second one, and I know I probably won't get...
Well, I'm embarrassed about the way I felt. Because I felt, that's wrong and that's dirty, and I shouldn't have had that feeling. I should have been more repertorial, and then, as I've said, 25 years later, and when I told this story to Ford, and then I went through and I turned to him and I said, "Mr. President, you're not a son of a bitch. I was wrong." And he said, "Can I get that written out and signed?" I've never heard a reporter say that.
I have to say I never have either, but my second question was deep throat. Do you think anyone, anytime, will ever find out who this man was? I've heard every hypothesis, from it was Ford to just some wacko on the street. Do you think we'll ever find out who Deep Throat was?
How old are you? You will. That's the story of the identity of that source will be told. All the records have been put together on it in case something happens to me prematurely. It's a fascinating story, a fascinating human story. You know those match tricks where somebody will put matches out in 4 squares and say, "Move one match and make 9 triangles," and you think, "Oh no, that's impossible, it can't be done," and then they'll move one match and do it. If you know the answer, it seems obvious. You do not know the identity of Deep Throat, so it does not seem obvious. I do know the identity, and it does seem obvious. I'll bet you didn't expect you were going to get that clarification.
And I look forward to finding
No,
out.
it is a great human story where somebody embedded his identity in not being that source and lied to family, colleagues, and friends and co-workers, and doesn't want it known as long as he's alive. And when he's you'll see. You'll go. You're really young, so it'll come out, and you'll say, okay.
First, I've got to tell you, I'm a journalist who got into the business. A lot of it has to do with, and I know you've heard it a million times, I read all the President's Men when I was a senior in high school, and I thank you for that, because that was truly inspiration. My question, and it's a journalist's question, I'm curious, you talked about being humbled by mistakes that you made or things you didn't know, and I'm just curious if you can give me a couple of examples of that.
You want more examples?
I guess the big guys feel that way too.
Okay, well, I mean, it is an endless list. Let's take something that's very much the topic of the day, terrorism. Now, in the 80s, after the Beirut Marine barracks bombing, 1983, I went to the Middle East with 2 reporters from the Post, and we spent weeks as police report. Who did it? And we found out who did it. And we ran stories saying Syria and Iran were behind the Marine barracks bombing, which is now fully authenticated. We had the name of the lieutenant colonel in Syrian intelligence who supplied the $50,000 to the guy who made the bomb. And point being, I knew a lot about terrorism, and I knew it was real and an immense problem, and I didn't work on it before 9/11. I quite frankly thought Osama bin Laden was, he doesn't have a country, he looks kooky, he doesn't know how, he probably doesn't, he doesn't shave, probably doesn't bathe. How can we take this guy seriously? And I totally dropped the ball. And when Richard Clark went before the 9/11 Commission and apologized, it's exactly what I felt and said. I, as a journalist, failed failed miserably because I knew it was there and the capacity and it was real. And I've been reporting on the CIA all my life, really. Going back to Watergate, and should have been on the case, but it was hard, and there was that sense, well, suppose you write and understand terrorism and there's no attack, you will have wasted 2 years or 5 years or 1 year. So, I don't want to go on, but it's a long list, believe me.
Well, thank you very much for everything you've done to help America. In your roles as a member of the Fourth Estate, would you compare the Nixon administration and the press's access to that administration versus the current Bush administration? Was there more access to the Nixon administration than there is the Bush administration? And secondly, how does the consolidation of the Fourth Estate bear for our democracy? Was that ill or good?
When you say access, I go out and I move the flower pot on my balcony, hoping that somebody in the Bush administration will go to the underground garage and meet with me. It's been a lot of lonely nights there.
My understanding is that reporters' calls aren't returned. There's just there's not much access to the press. It's pretty well controlled, very buttoned down.
It is buttoned down and controlled. I found I could get my questions answered. And I interviewed, for the first book I did, I sent the president a 20-page memo saying this is what I want to talk to. And my colleagues at the Washington Post said, you sent George W. Bush a 20-page memo? He's never read a 20-page. Why do you not want to interview him? And they called a couple of days later and said, come on down to his ranch in Crawford. I could interview him for an hour. I interviewed him for 2.5 hours, nonstop, answered 300 questions. No one from the press office, no one from the communications office. There was somebody from the White House recording it, and Condi Rice was there, and the president and myself, and that was it. And a researcher at the Washington Post has checked and found that it's the longest interview a sitting president has ever given on one subject. For the current book, I can't, let me just say you will be astounded at the amount of detailed information about what really happened and the sequence, and there's a whole secret history about the war in Iraq. Now, did somebody call me up and say, come on and get it? No. It's starting at the low level, mid-level, getting details, getting so much information that people feel they have to talk to you, and then they do, and you get a little bit more, and you build on it, and so forth. So you can get the answers to the question. Just the point I was making, Richard Clark is making this point, well, there wasn't a sense of urgency. Well, the president told me that. It's on page 39 of Bush at War. It's always possible to get the information. And, the First Amendment doesn't say it's going to be easy.
I'm a political science major here at UCF. And
Good for you.
Thank you. And we study the impacts of Watergate in almost every class. I was curious, what are your thoughts on the current state of investigative reporting and journalism today? And also, do you think that the Freedom Act could be used to find out when government officials and presidents aren't serving the greater good, like you mentioned in your speech?
Okay, the Freedom of Information Act is important. I have pending requests for stuff from the Reagan administration, and just about 6 months ago, I got a bunch of documents, top secret, and everything's blanked out. Now, this is 20 years after the event. At reporting, I was able to get the top secret notes of 50 National Security Council meetings after 9/11 to show exactly what happened in the language, in the order, not laundered, showing Bush, in Bush at war, acting rather impulsively many times, wanting to start the bombing of Afghanistan a week before and so forth. So it's not, as Dick Cheney said to one of his aides, it's not pretty. So I think reporting works much better than trying to get things through the Freedom of Information Act. Now, the question of investigative reporting now, there's a real problem in the news business. When, just an example, Carl Bernstein and I would work on a Watergate story. We would do a draft, and we wrote on, are you familiar with things called typewriters? You remember what that was? And 6-ply paper, and you had to actually have muscles to push down the keys. And they would take copies of the stories and give them to Bradley, the editor, and to managing editor, and then we would meet and talk, and they'd say, what about this? Is there a source there? I've heard this. Check this. This doesn't sound right. And we could work 3 weeks or more on one story. Now, in the current internet, cable television, instant news environment, if it looks like you have a bit of a story, an exclusive, just a fact, minor, insignificant, somebody will be in my office saying, can we get it on the internet by 10 a.m.? So what does that do? We were continually telling people the latest, but the problem with the latest, you drive down the road in your car, and they come on and say, stand by for the latest on the Dow Industrial Average. And, people up front here then think, oh, should I pull my car to the side of the road? It sounds bad. Then they come on and say, the Dow Industrial Average is down 1 point. Now, that's the latest, and it's true, but it has no meaning. No meaning. And if we're going to go around in the news business and watch this micro advance on, the latest, you see it on cable television. Stand by, we're outside the hearing here in Colorado, and it's no news, but it's the latest no news. And so we dilute. And newspaper business is just like any other business. If the product is good, we'll survive and do well. But if people know that these things don't have any meaning, so we got to fix that. We have to do more in-depth reporting, trying to really understand what goes on, and that takes time. And it is a world dominated by impatience. Next.
All right, 2 questions. Number 1, what do you think of the current state of the media, sort of polarizing? Like in Europe, all magazines and journals and European Time, European Newsweek, and all this stuff. When you read about it in American English, referred to as such and such publication, which is conservative or liberal. What do you think of the trend in modern America, particularly on TV, the Fox News and the other stuff that people say, this is all liberal, this is all right-wing, and
I think it doesn't work very well because people. It's okay to have opinions and debates, but it shouldn't get into the news, and that got to really understand what's going on. Managing editor at the Washington Post, Howard Simons, I remember once when I was first at the Post working on a story, and I was struggling, as I always did, with the writing, and he came by and gave me a pat on the back and said, "You can't understand a man in an afternoon." And that's the God's truth. You can't. You can't understand anything in an afternoon, and understanding should be the goal, not some political spin. Next.
First, thank you so much for coming on. Obviously, very fortunate when a university offers such a wonderful, informative speaker such as yourself. Mainly, though, what I wanted to ask was, as I look around the room, I'm very happy to see the wide range of age, but sometimes I find myself disappointed in how few people of my own age are here. And I just wonder what you think of the overall legacy of Watergate being our people, again, is the whole range of age paying attention to it, trying to learn less, or are you seeing it die off as people age, or just what are your thoughts on that?
It's a good question, and I don't know the answer. And again, I think it's incumbent on the people in the newspaper business or the news business or people who teach in colleges, universities, or elsewhere to stimulate that interest and find a way to make it clear to people that these things are immensely relevant. You know, just think about, we're here tonight. There are 100,000 of our fellow countrymen and countrywomen in Iraq. And what do you think it's like in Iraq? You know, they're going down the roads worrying. It's really a different life there, to say the least. And those decisions are made by political leaders. And that point ought to be driven home to people of all ages, particularly young people. How old are you? 19. Yeah, you know, there could be a mobilization and you could be drafted, you realize, at some point.
You seem more qualified than anybody to maybe answer this question, which is burning in a lot of people. Is Bush a liar?
You notice the movement of uneasiness behind the podium. First of all, I think the answer to that question is it's easier to describe the creation of the universe. And I have found in my dealings with him that he's quite direct and not a liar. But, you know, you don't know what you don't know. And it is a critical question. And you know, in the politics, in the White House, you have to be a truth teller, and you know, we will weigh that and debate that. But I have not seen evidence that would say, you know, this is a clear lie. There is spin, and you know, that's one of the problems. How do you differentiate spin from a lie to just emphasis? It's complex. Good question. I hope to answer it before I die.
I'm kind of embarrassed to ask this, but I'm going to get a chance to again. You, along with Carl Bernstein, wrote really one of the great detective novels of the 20th century. And everybody always asks about Nixon, why Watergate? And I need to really ask you, why Watergate? Why did you and Bernstein follow a story that so many times it seemed that you were dead ends, where you had people saying, no, there's nothing here, you can't do this, and yet you continued?
What happened, I served in the Navy 5 years. I got out and I was going to go to law school, and then I thought, oh God, you know, 3 years of going back to school, and then I've got to find something to do, and I tried to get a job at the Washington Post. And I had no experience, and they gave me a 2-week tryout. This is the August of 1970. And I wrote about 14 stories, none of which they published, none of which were very good, if any good at all. And the editor, metropolitan editor, who named Harry Rosenfeld, who I worked for on Watergate 2 years later, called me in and said, you know, you don't know how to do this. And I said, thank you, but I found out something. I love it. I don't know how to do it, but I know that I love it. And I went and worked at a weekly paper in Maryland for 1 year, and they hired me at the Post. That was September 1971. In fact, I sat outside of Ben Bradley's office in September 71, unbeknownst to me or Bradley. Gordon Liddy and Howard Hunt were out at Dulles Airport getting on the plane to go to Los Angeles to burglarize Ellsberg's psychiatrist's office. As best we can tell at the exact moment, and started, and I loved working on the paper, and I did night police and worked a night shift from 6:30 to 2:30, and then went and slept. I was unmarried. I went back and worked a day shift. So the morning of June 17th, 1972, the Watergate burglary, and the 5 burglars are arrested. It's a beautiful, spectacular day in Washington. Anyone with any sanity is out enjoying the outdoors. And the editors for the weekend are sitting around. They have this report of this burglary. And they say, who would be dumb enough to come in and work on this beautiful Saturday morning? Woodward. So I got called. Bernstein had a nose and was working that day. And so we, with about 8 people, worked on the first day's story that Saturday, which appeared Sunday. Sunday morning, 2 people showed up at the office, Bernstein and myself, unmarried, and learned through another reporter that the head burglar, James McCord, had been head of security at an organization called the Central Intelligence Agency, and had been head of security at the Nixon Reelection Committee. And it was, you know, what's going on here? And one clue led to the next, to the next, to the next, and it just never stopped. And as Bill Grider, a writer at the Post, said, will the wonders of Watergate never cease? And they never did. So we just stayed on it. Thank you.
I have to ask you, what do you hope your place in the history books will be? And do you think you're responsible for ever changing the relationship between the president and the media?
No. See, the history book, I mean, the only thing, I'm a reporter. That's what I am. If somebody asks me, what do? I'm a reporter. I'm not a presidential historian. I'm not people have these titles that they give themselves. I'm a reporter and try to find out what happened. And often it takes an awful long time to get there. And so I don't feel that. What happened in Watergate, Carl, and this is a distortion. When we wrote All the President's Men, we were going to write about the Nixon White House and John Mitchell and Liddy and Hunt and the people who were involved. And the story was going so fast, we had to write about reporting the part that we did. And that then it was necessity. It was the way to get the book done, quite frankly. And then they made a movie, and people think that we caused Watergate. We didn't. I mean, there are people, Tom Railsback from the House Judiciary Committee, Elizabeth Holtzman, I mean, the House Judiciary Committee, the Senate Watergate Committee, the Special Prosecutor's Office, the Supreme Court, the engine of government brought Nixon to justice. And most significantly, and this gets lost, and maybe it would be the final point I would make, people say, well, it was the Democrats, or it was the media, or whatever. You know who brought Nixon down, other than the truth that he brought himself down? It was the Republicans who brought Nixon down. Nixon had to resign because the Republican Party, I think probably best exemplified by people like Tom Railsback, Republican from Illinois, hard to vote for impeachment, but he did as a matter of conscience. And that group of Republicans, and probably most visibly symbolized by Barry Goldwater, the conscience of the party, looked at Nixon, listened to it, and just said, I remember he once said to me, he said, too many lies, too many crimes. And Goldwater went to Nixon and Nixon said, well, how many votes in a Senate trial do you think I'll have? Maybe 10, 20 or something? And Goldwater said 4. It's 96-4 against you. And that's when Nixon realized he'd lost his own party. And it's the conservative Republicans who looked at the record. It's the Republicans of that ilk who just said, we don't like law breaking. We don't like unsafe concentrations of power. And that's what happened in the Nixon presidency, and that's why Nixon left. So it's the engine of government in the Republican Party. Carl and I were there kind of, as I tried to describe, accidents, who were young, and you didn't need to be curious because it was just one shocker after another, and it never stopped. And so it was very easy to keep on the story. And then, quite frankly, we had, and I guess this is the very last thing I would say, Katharine Graham, who was the owner, publisher of the Washington Post then, who really backed us by not getting involved in a way. And I remember 6 months after the Watergate burglary, she called me up for lunch. And Carl had to go to a funeral, and so she had she was really the best newspaper person, certainly the most important newspaper person of the last half of the last century. She had what I called mind on, hands off. She was intellectually engaged with what you were doing, but she didn't direct it and tell you, do it this way, do it that way. Went up to lunch, and I had just barely met her. And we'd written our important Watergate stories at that point. And I remember going in, and she's sitting there, and she had this look on her face of, what have you boys been doing with my newspaper? And she had a lot of questions, a lot of information. She knew Kissinger, she knew lots of people. I'm just, mind fully engaged. And then at the end, she got to the critical question. She said, well, when will we, this is now January 1973, we were alone, really alone. Been denounced. Most people at our own newspaper didn't believe what we had written. And she said, well, when is all the truth going to come out? And I said, Carl and I thought all the truth would never come out. That Nixon and his group were very good at scaring people, compartmentalizing information, keeping information secret. These were clearly crimes. So the answer was never. And I remember she had this stricken look across the lunch table, and she said exactly the following. When I said never, she said, never? Don't tell me never. I left that lunch a motivated employee. It wasn't a threatening, don't tell me never. It was the bar's up here. Our job, use all your resources, use all the resources of the paper to get to the bottom of this. Never, don't tell me never. And that's the standard. That's where the bar should be in journalism. We can't run around and say, the very tough question from the young man about, is Bush a liar? That's a fair, legitimate question. You can't, notice I didn't say, well, we'll never know. So the Katharine Graham standard of don't tell me never, we don't meet it often enough, but it's really something to aspire to, and it's something that's the root of this business. And it takes an owner, it takes a leader to have the guts, because they had just issued the Washington Post stock, and it's known the Nixon people got people to challenge the TV licenses that the Washington Post company had, and that stock tanked. I mean, you almost thought it was an internet stock before 30 years before, 25 years before the internet, and no pressure, no flinching, no kind of how can you do this, just don't tell me never. Thanks. Really
Richard Nixon broke my heart, left a piece of me up there that'll never quite be the same. And I know with Rails, who was there in the front lines and was the Republican who basically got some Southern Democrats and Republicans together to write the articles of impeachment, that has left a scar in Tom. Because President Nixon had campaigned for both of us. I was one of the Nixon youth chairmen, along with President Bush, Julie Nixon, Eisenhower, Lowell Weicker in '72. I believed in President Nixon. And I don't know any of you in your lives have really cared about something and have believed in something and had it just turn out a different way. And it still hurts to talk about it. Rails and I were talking about it before, that it brings back a flood of memories that are really difficult memories. But on the other hand, there are memories that you're really proud of, because I did not take an oath to the Republican Party. I took an oath to the Constitution. And we went through a period of time where there was a real question if this Constitution would work. What if the President hadn't turned the tapes over? You can go with so many what ifs, and despite many things that President Nixon did or didn't do, he had something inside him, at least, that didn't let him take that last step that would have been a total disaster. When I talk to young people, I tell them that the Watergate proved that this country has a rule of law, that no one's above the rule of law, not even the President. And we have a Constitution that works under incredible pressures, because believe me, Bob might have been writing it, but we were living it. Every day you'd pick up the paper and you'd think, oh my God, what's gone wrong today? And it always had gone wrong today. You just didn't know what it was. It was like a Chinese torture going through this day after day and week after week and month after month. And you go to the Republican leadership meetings and you're trying to keep everything together and figure out what to do and how to do it and how to make some sense out of it. And you couldn't make any sense out of it. Why anybody in their right minds would break into the political headquarters of a Democrat or Republican Party and expect to find anything is beyond comprehension. It's truly the dumbest thing I have heard of in my life. And why the President didn't just say, this is stupid, whoever did it ought to go to jail, and I'm going to fire them all, end of story. This whole thing had been over, but it didn't. It was really a Greek tragedy. And it's something that if Bob had written or somebody had written ahead of time, I wouldn't have believed. Because it just doesn't really make any sense. But there we were in the middle of it. I was relatively young, new in the leadership. I thought I joined Custer's 7th Cavalry right before the Little Bighorn, and it turned out exactly that way. But I suppose in looking back at it, it is something that you can be proud of in the sense that we as a country and we as a Congress really rose to whatever the challenge was. And we did that. And I think we are a better country today because of what we went through. Now, I don't recommend this as a yearly thing. But we are a better country because we did meet the challenge. And we ended, I think, a string of imperial presidencies that no matter who the president is now, there's a different standard that they have to live up to. There's a different standard of openness. There's also not a cozy relationship between the press and the political world as it should be. There's maybe a healthy respect or sometimes disrespect, I'm not so sure what, but it is not the cozy relationship that it used to be. And that, Bob, to you and to Carl and to the people who did it, I think you were very modest. I think you had a significant part of what went on. You kept the process moving, and you were maybe the people throwing gas on the fire to move it along. And I think it was one of the things that was significant. It wasn't just the Congress or the press, but it was also the people in this country. There were a number of things moving this along to a conclusion. And so while I don't certainly at those times agree with you, maybe like Jerry Ford, I don't think you are a son of a bitch. So thank you very much for coming.